And we're on. Welcome everybody to, what is this? This is the Astro Imaging channel, isn't it? Our weekly everything about astrophotography. This week we have David Biggs, who's going to talk about a subject I really have a keen interest in. And that is planetary and solar imaging. And I'm sure you know, if you've done this before, you end up with stacks that won't look all that great. And then you see all these great images posted on AstroBin and you say, well, how do they get there? How do they get from these kind of blurry images to the sharp images? Well, David has written some new software and he's going to explain one of the ways that you can do that. But before we get to David, I'm going to share my screen if I remember which thing to go here. Share screen. Entire screen. I'll go from the infinite. And can everyone see the calendar? Have I got the calendar up?
Yep.
The calendar is up. So we got David this week. We got Rod Palmier next week. Rod's, I think he's a neurosurgeon that always gives excellent, detailed investigations and explanations of things that we really don't pay a lot of attention to. And next week, he's going to talk about LDNs. The week after is July 4th holiday, sort of, and we're not going to have that. After that, John, and after that, Tom, and we got a few lined up for almost all through July, except for the holiday and part of August. But things are going to change a little bit. How do I stop sharing? Why do I stop sharing? Okay, I've stopped sharing. So we've been discussing for quite a while about running a show every Sunday. And the issue is oftentimes trying to find people and recruit them to put on a presentation. And you know, if you've watched this show, every week we say, anyone out there that wants to give a presentation, please let us know. And we've been doing this for how long, Alex? 11 years? Is it coming up on 11 years? That's a lot of shows. And it sometimes gets difficult to fill every single Sunday. So what we've kind of decided to do, instead of trying to do a show every week, that we'll probably do 2 or 3 shows a month and give us a little breathing space so we don't have to constantly nag everyone out there about coming on the show. Now, that's what we're planning to do probably starting in August, because I think we filled up July except for the holiday. But things could change. In other words, if all of a sudden we say, no, we need a show every week and we get a bunch of people that are willing to present, we'll fill in the calendar and put on more shows. But going forward, I think we're going to be doing 2, maybe 3 shows a month. And that'll be more comfortable. We won't have to recruit quite as aggressively. And we'll still bring you excellent shows. So those of you who subscribe will get notifications. So if we don't have a show and all of a sudden you come and say, where's your show? Now you know why. So keep on tuning in. We're still going to have excellent presenters, as you've seen from the schedule I just brought up. But, things change. Now, I don't think there's anything else to announce. So David, if you are ready to go, why don't you take over the show and tell us about your new software?
Great. Thank you, Eric. And see if this works. Hold on. Gotta get in the right presentation. Back up the basket, David. Okay. Thank you, everyone. And so this is a talk I'd like to give all about enhancing planetary, lunar, and solar images using a software I developed that is called BiggSky. I just got the question of why did I name it BiggSky? Well, I thought since the guy who created Cyril, his first name is Cyril, and the guy who created Blur Exterminator and Noise Exterminator, he's Russ Exterminator. So I thought I may as well just go for that same idea. I'm also in a competition with George R.R. Martin to find whether he will release his book first or whether I will get my software out, because this has been software that's been in development for at least 5 years, and the research for this has been going on for about 30 years now. So anyway, we'll get there eventually. So you might remember me from such educational videos as Deconvolution in the Dark, which I did 3 years ago, which was essentially the introduction to all the underlying ideas and technology behind deconvolutions, particularly blind deconvolution. So if you want a refresher or actually want to go into all the math of how that works, you can see that presentation. This presentation, I'm aiming for no equations. So this is more of a practical application, and I'm really not going to discuss too much about how the actually underlying technology works. So a little bit about me. I have a PhD in electrical and electronic engineering. If you haven't worked out my funny accent, I'm originally from New Zealand, and I did this in the University of Auckland in the mid-1990s. My research was in blind deconvolution and acceleration of image restoration algorithms. And this was sort of, it was partly done for material science, but back in those days, there was a lot of publicly available Hubble data that was blurred before the COSTAR upgrade. So there was lots of astronomy data that could be freely available to poor little people down in the bottom of the South Pacific who didn't have access to large telescopes. So that was sort of like the basis. And I spent most of my work trying to work on what I call restoration of extended objects, which are things like planets and galaxies as opposed to star fields. So the idea was restoring things without actually having stars to measure. And in my professional work, I am an independent software developer. I've previously worked for a company that developed 3D deconvolution for live cell biological specimens, things like wide field confocal multiphoton microscopes. I do image processing analysis for biomedical imaging, and my company is called KB Imaging Solutions. So that's sort of my day job. And hopefully I will be able to turn some of the astronomy stuff also into my day job to pay all the bills when you have children in college and dogs and stuff like that. Little equipment porn. So this is my my new telescope, but actually old telescope. This is very old school. This is one of the original Officina Stellari, which was in the day was actually called A&M. So this is a 360 millimeter or 14.5 inch Ritchie Crichton sitting in my next dome on an AP 1200 mount. This is actually sitting in my backyard. I live just outside Sacramento, sort of towards Auburn, the foothills of the Sierras. I have like 4 to 5 skies, which isn't too bad to the north and the east. It's not too great to the south. So this is my the system, and I also originally had the Stellar View 90 millimeter refractor, which is what I have been doing. I myself am actually more into deep sky imaging, mainly because I only had a refractor for the longest time. So I actually have done very little lunar, planetary, and solar, and so it's been the help of all the different people in the community who provided me images that have actually been allowed me to do this work. Just a couple of examples of narrowband imaging I have with my new system. One of the slightly non-optimal thing is I'm using a ASI 1600 camera. So one of the smaller chip sizes on a very large system. So my field of view is about 0.3 degrees, which makes framing things a little bit interesting. But here's 2 images that I got last year, all narrowband, one for 35 hours and one for 55 hours. So I'm still getting everything dialed and properly with the scope. And but these images were also processed with my software, plus the help of StarNet for star removal. So the software was originally developed for deep sky imaging, but has morphed into a lot more lunar, planetary, and solar as with input from the community. So really quickly, I just want to tell you this term deconvolution, what is the premise for it? And the idea is that the image you observe through your scope is not actually the true image. And if we can model how the observed image is distorted, we can compensate for it mathematically and get a better estimate of the true. So we're not going to be able to get the true image, but we want a better estimate. And it's this thing called the point spread function, or the PSF, which you'll hear me talk about lots of times, is how it characterizes how the light's distorted. And if you go into all the math, the way the image is formed is based on a thing called the convolution operation, which is a mathematical term. Therefore, reversing convolution is called deconvolution. And so that's where this term comes from. So what it means is we're trying to correct the image in a mathematically accurate way. And this all depends on the algorithm, the point spread function, the noise limits. There are lots of things that limit us being able to get the true perfect image back. And so what is convolution? And this, hopefully this is familiar for most of you, but if not, it's in our case here, we're looking at a two-dimensional operator. So the top left image is just like, imagine that's a perfect star field. And then if we apply one of 4 different point spread functions. So a delta function does nothing. A Gaussian does a blur. If your image is defocused, every point turns into a disk. And then if you get motion, which is often if you've bumped your scope or your tracking is off, then you get a line. And so this just shows how every point in the image is turned into a point spread function that's added together. So that's done by convolution. So why do we want to enhance our lunar planetary images? Well, we know that we use lucky imaging to select the best quality images because the skies, the atmosphere is changing all the time. And what we can do is we can pick out the best quality images, i.e. the ones that are the sharpest out of all the mess, are the ones that are blurry. And then if we just use those ones, then we can get a better image. However, there is still an improvement because the lucky imaging gets the best quality images, but there's still limits based on atmospheric seeing and other atmospheric effects and the size of your telescope, and there are lots of things that degrade your image. And while stacking reduces the noise and corrects for warping, which is sort of like the shimmer or the wobbliness of your image, it doesn't improve the resolution. And so deconvolution aims to restore those features, and of course we need to know the point spread function to do that. The problem is we don't know what the point spread function is, because unless you have a very, very large laser and can shine it into the atmosphere and ignite a layer of sodium up there and get an artificial star, which is how adaptive optics works, then it's very hard to get the point spread function. Of course, we could always use stars when we're doing deep sky imaging, but in the case of lunar and planetary imaging, we normally don't have any stars available to do that. So there's a thing called blind deconvolution, and blind deconvolution gets its term because it's trying to estimate the image directly from the point spread function directly from the observed image, which may seem magical, but there's actually a lot of math backing up how this works, especially in 2 or more dimensions. And the quality of your restoration very much depends on the quality of the input data. So as I said, I'm not going to review how the algorithms works, but assume that we have a little magical but imperfect black box. And this magical black box, you give it the image and it'll give you the point spread function and an estimate of your the true image. And what we wanted to know is, assuming we have this black box, how can we use this to improve our images? And at the end of the day, what it'll actually show you is how well your equipment is operating and how good your seeing is, because the blur often obscures things that you might not otherwise see. So what is this blind deconvolution black box? And so the thing is, the algorithm likes linear data, it wants photometric accuracy, ideally it wants 16-bit raw files, it wants natural features and details, it wants clean data, little noise, it also wants a consistent point spread function, and it also likes calibrated images. What causes its problems are things that are essentially artificial. So noise is probably one of the biggest problems. That's photon noise, which is the standard pulsar noise you get in your images, as well as hot and dead pixels. Anything artificial like hard edges, boundary artifacts, zero intensities, manipulated backgrounds such that the background goes to zero, saturated intensities, drizzle artifacts, or JPEG compression. It really hates compression. So what we want to do here is understand the limitations to work out how we're going to get good results. And how the software works is you input it in an observed image or a region of interest. It will give you then the point spread function, and then that is used to process the entire image through a thing that's called iterative deconvolution. And if any of you have heard the terms like Richardson-Lucy or Lucy-Richardson algorithms, that is what these algorithms are based on. So not another astronomy application. Why do we need another application? Well, I started my journey in astrophotography back in about 2017. And I found that there was whether there's a perception or even just trying to use software, there was like a steep learning curve and trying to get into some of the software. Some of it had like a poor first impression when loading the images. It's like I would load up an image and then I couldn't see anything. There's often a focus on developing the algorithm and not developing the underlying GUI. There are too many controls, sliders, and parameters to adjust. There are too many files and windows to handle. You need all these different programs, and then you need lots of RAM disk space. The computer I'm using at the moment is about 17 years old. It only had 8 gig of RAM at the time I was doing it, and very little disk space, and so I was always running into disk space issues. Lots of things run on Windows, but not a lot of things run on Mac. I'm a Windows person, but I know lots of Mac users would like more software. And then I also was looking for an architecture to support the development of the deconvolution technologies. And I also wanted to learn about how all of the image processing techniques work. So rather than learn how something, other software, I decided, hey, why don't I just write my own? Which is one of those, futile efforts that people do and think like, oh, this will be easy, and then it's not. So what is BiggSky? So it's an application for post-processing of astronomy images, both deep sky, lunar, solar, planetary. It does multiple channels and more than just RGB, LRGB, narrowband, color mono. It is specifically designed for the automated processing of large volumes of data. So if you get gigabytes of data every night and want a way to process it automatically, I'm very much into automation, optimization of algorithms. It's designed to be ease of use and organized file handling. It's cross-platform. It does support GPU processing on NVIDIA GPUs. Ideally, it requires low computational resources, and it does all the normal sorts of things that you would want to do. It imports, calibrates, does quality analysis, stacking, deconvolution, colorization movies. It also does everything in 32-bit floating point, so there is high accuracy. You're not losing any data when having to save it back to 16-bit. So it preserves linearity. It does on-the-fly processing and rendering, so it doesn't need any intermediate files. And at the moment, there is no AI or deep learning involved in this software at all. It is all just regular classical hard math. And of course, it also has applications in other fields such as like medical imaging or retinal imaging. And so I'm looking for lots of different applications for this. So why might you want to use the software? Well, you can get an Astro image of the day, in theory. This is an image from one of my beta testers, Paul Margulies, from back in March. He was using the software with very little guidance and was able to get an image of the Astro image of the day. And he just used SharpCat for capture, AutoStacker for stacking. He used the BiggSky for the enhancement, and then Photoshop to finish off the final things. And I think you'll appreciate both the quality of his imaging and his instrument and the processing involved to get that. So it was very nice to see that he was able to get that awarded. There's also a article in this month's Astronomy Now magazine, which just came out, which is a article by Jeff Granger on high resolution imaging, lunar imaging, that has results using BiggSky. He's another one of the beta testers. And so again, so we're starting to get some traction, and there have been some beta testers who've been using this for almost 3 years now, but it's really taken a while to get everything going. And in the last year, we're getting more people being able to test it. And you will be able to test it at the end of this presentation because it's now actually generally available for demo testing. Just a few quick concepts. So BiggSky works on the concept of projects. So a project is, for example, a particular target, like, for example, M31. And each of those, a project has multiple data sets. And each of those data sets is, for example, a particular filter, or red, green, blue, hydrogen alpha, or combinations of exposures or calibration images. So a project has multiple data sets, and then each data set has the raw frames and then all the process frames as part of it. So it tries to organize everything in that way. Excuse me a minute. And then all the data is stored as 32-bit floating point data, and the views are rendered using nonlinear algorithms on the fly, but it always keeps the original data in linear mode. I guess that would be equivalent to a screen transfer function in PixInsight. And then it also has the concept of directories. It keeps the images, the raw source files, separate from the processing files. So if your source files are on an external drive or NAS, and then the final process files, you can keep those separate. This is what the GUI looks like. And so everything is done in terms of buttons and tabs. There are menus, but it's not a menu-driven application. It's a button control panel-driven application. And so on the left is where you have all your projects and data sets. On the right is where you have the tabs for the buttons for doing the processing. Everything is actually designed to be a little bit constrained in terms of the amount of space available. So I have to really think about minimizing the number of buttons and options available, and just distill everything down to like what's actually needed. And then at the bottom, there are various panels for providing information about images and render modes and plots and cropping and stuff like that. So everything runs off this this one screen. So how to get started? So basically, after you install the application, you open your image that you've probably stacked and auto stack it. You want ideally you want 16-bit images that are typical PNG. Start with no drizzling or sharpening, because that's pre-processing. We don't want. We also avoid pixel saturation. You set your save options to your output format you want. And then you click the deconvolve button, and then in theory, if everything works out, you will get your result. That's all. It's like one button deconvolution. And I'll run through this in a minute, but you basically click. You can then blink between the original and the decon, and then if you decide, you can adjust various parameters to improve the result, or you can blend it if you think it's too sharp or there's excess noise. So just to show you, this is what happens. So you open the application. This is the start panel, which show and there are buttons highlighted in yellow here. So the open images or the loaded project. So that's a previously saved project. So once you open the image, if the software can't work out from the file name what the type is, often people have like Jupiter or Saturn or Moon in the file name, but if it can't work that out, it asks you what type of file it is. Just that has some pre-settings that help. So you set the target type, and then this is what your display will look like. It'll show you the full image. And then from there, you can change the render mode. So for example, if I show you before, it looks a bit dark. So hey, let's go down to render, and we can change the gamma here. For example, we can set the gamma to 2, click render. That will then change the rendering, and you can see also that there are 2 histograms. There is the data histogram, which is the histogram for the raw data, and then the display histogram, which is the histogram for what's being displayed on the screen. And this can help you adjust your display rendering better than what might just be the the raw underlying linear data. And these are also displayed in logarithmic scales. You can turn it off, but so you can sort of see, the background doesn't overwhelm things, which often happens. So once you have your display like you want, you simply click the deconvolve button, which is over here. So the deconvolve button, that will do an automatic one-step deconvolution. If you want to go straight to the settings, you just hit the little arrow button to the right of the deconvolve button. That'll take you to the deconvolve tab. And so now this is the deconvolution result. I'll blink this in a moment, but you can click a blink button, and that'll blink between the frames, the original frames, and the decon results. So these are the buttons at the top here that source image and then the process image are easy to access between the two. So this, hopefully you'll be able to see this is coming through on your screen, is a blink between the original image and the deconvolved image in one click. Now, oftentimes that works fine, but also sometimes you want to adjust things, or let's go through and find out exactly what is going on and what the software is doing. So the first thing is, on any image, it wants to work out the region, the point spread function. And it does that from a region of interest. It does that for two reasons. One is estimating the point spread function takes a lot of processing, a lot more processing the whole image. So by looking at just a region of interest, it's a lot faster to do it that way. And also then we can tell the software to focus on certain regions where we think that there's actually lots of details to try and estimate the point spread function from. And in lunar images, we often have lots of nice edges and details, so there's lots of information there for the algorithm to work on. But we want to avoid, we want a high contrast area, but we want to exclude like the disk edge and the terminator, because those are hard boundaries that sometimes cause issues. So the auto ROI will automatically put an ROI in what it thinks is the highest contrast area. But what we might want to do is we want to say, hey, let's move that ROI to cover a whole crater, avoid the disk edge, and basically be about 25% of the image width. Is sort of a good, starting rule of thumb. And then if we want to preview what happens before we're doing the entire processing, we can check the button here down called preview. So this is the button here called preview. We hit preview, it'll just process this region and it won't save anything, and you can adjust the parameters and as you desire without committing to a full processing. And so here's the original, here's the deconvolved, and it's just deconvolved the region of interest. And again, we can blink back and forward between those using the blink control. And then if we like what we see there, what the software does automatically and what you can do manually is you can check the reuse point spread function button. So what it has done is it's estimated the point spread function from that region, and now we can reuse it and run a decon on the entire frame. So this is now the processing of the entire frame using that point spread function that we got from the region of interest. And so that's what you can do manually, but that's what the deconvolve button will do automatically for you. Also, it'll do it if you don't have the preview on and you don't have the reuse, it'll do that all for you. And then if you look down the bottom here, the plots tab will show you this is the point spread function here. So this is the point spread function that's blowing up, of course, because this is a 32 pixel radius point spread function. So it's about 66 pixels across. So you can sort of like see what your point spread function looks like if you're interested. And then you can zoom and pan the image. So you can zoom up using the buttons on the top, and you can look at the various, you can pan around your image, you can blink, and you can, the idea what you want to do is you want to convince yourself that features you see in the deconvolved image were there in the original image, but they may not have been easily visible. So we shouldn't be creating features that were not there originally. Everything should be there, but it's often just obscured by the blur. And then if you want to convince yourself how that the decon works, there's a decon analysis. And all this is doing is, so on the left top is the original image. On the top right is the deconvolution. If you convolve the deconvolution with the point spread function, it should give you back your original observation. And that's how it's working. And so what that is termed as the reblurred image. So if we estimate an image and a point spread function and convolve them together, and we get back the original, something that matches the original, or is at least close to it, then we've done a pretty good job of separating the point spread function from the original data. And you may not be able to see here, but this is a ratio of the original and the reblurred, which is all part of the algorithm. And you can see here that there's just some very slight differences based on intensity and noise. And the standard deviation of the variation here is about 0.5%. So this is actually a very accurate deconvolution. I actually had to boost up the contrast on the ratio, otherwise it just looks gray because of the variations like plus or minus less than 5% at the limits.
David?
Yes.
David? So is this something that you can click a button and do, or do you have to specifically go in and reblur the image?
So there's a function in the software called decon analysis. It's sort of like a extra for experts. It's under the functions menu, but it'll generate this this display for you as in a 2x2 grid if you're really interested in seeing convincing yourself that it works.
Should this be part of the process to see how far you go with decon?
Yeah, I mean it's a good learning tool. I mean, once you get into processing huge, I guess once you get confidence with the software and have sort of confidence that it's doing what you want to do, then I'm not sure many people do this, but at the start, when you sort of want to get into it and sort of understand what's going on, and you can also see if something's really bad, something weird in your image, this decon analysis, which is under the functions menu, can help reveal what's going on in your data.
Okay,
David, could you tell us what the ratio looks like when it's good and bad and things like that? I see a faint, I mean, that's basically difference between
that's
original and reblurred.
Yes, and the reason it's a ratio is because we're dealing with Poisson noise. So because it's multiplicative noise, it's essentially looking at the variance. It's essentially the error function that's used as part of the Richardson-Lucy algorithm, if you want to get all technical about it. I can't,
now,
but
if I see a recognizable pattern there that my deconvolution didn't have the right point spread function.
Yeah, so
if I see just kind of a gray, I did a good job.
Exactly, yeah, and you of course you can see here that the regions here that have more noise are actually the darker regions, and of course the darker regions are the ones that have more inherent relative noise. I mean, it's less there's less signal, but the actual the standard deviation of the noise is higher. And so typically what you'll see, if you have a problem, you'll either see there's just problems all over the image, or you might see that there's one particular part of the image that might have an issue that might be like biasing things. So this is sort of one of the ways of, I guess it's a QC, this is quality control for looking at the result.
I think we had a presentation on lunar imaging, and I remember we were told that in a crater, the shadows are absolute black. There is no light. So anything you deconvolve in a crater is probably noise or an artifact.
Well, yeah, so I guess there's one thing is, I don't think there are any actually visible features in those craters, but of course there is still, you're not going to get zero off your camera. Of course, there's still, there's, the offset and the camera noise and things like that. So so yeah, and it's probably all noise, and I don't think I see anything in those craters. So, but you're still getting noise from your system, just from the camera noise itself.
Well, you know that idea that the depths of a crater is going to be black. I got a problem with that. I mean, if you look at the top side of that crater, it's bright white. It's got to be reflecting some light down into the bottom of that crater.
Yeah, quite possible. I guess this is why this is all blind deconvolution, because I just get images and I process them and they come out, and I have no, I have no idea often what I'm processing or looking at. So I'll leave the technical details for that. But yeah, you definitely like secondary reflections of
I've just always had a problem with that since I first heard it, that the craters are going to be black because there's no light in there. The shadows are black because there's no, but there are sources of light coming from besides the sun.
Yeah, I don't know
the depth of a crater.
All I know is that if you're in that shadow there, it's going to be cold.
Okay.
So as long as we're kind of on that subject, how does what you're doing vary from the other forms of deconvolution, say, that you might find in PixInsight?
So I think the fundamental thing is for example, if you're doing any sort of normal process deconvolution, regular deconvolution, you need to give it the point spread function. And often there's some sort of is it a Gaussian, is it a Moffat, is it some sort of variation between the two? You're giving it a kernel that you want to do the processing with. I will say I've never used PixInsight, so I don't know. I just know from osmosis some of the things, but any of the other processing programs, somehow you have to tell it what the blur is in order to enhance it. And there's lots of sharpening filters that are essentially like a approximation to it. The whole point of this software is that by extracting the actual point spread function, which can be some very, it's not necessarily symmetric, it's not necessarily a Gaussian, but by estimating the true point spread function, you're going to get a much more accurate result, because if your PSF doesn't match your data, you're going to get ringing artifacts. And so the whole point of this is to get the most accurate representation of the point spread function without actually having to tell it yourself.
Thank you.
So just a couple of quick things to, in this particular data, there's something that's hard to tell here, but one is in cyan, there is actually true zero intensities, which is more likely come from the result of stacking, because all the line frames don't line up perfectly. So that's actual zeros that are artificial. So you have to be very careful about artificial zeros that are at edges that are often hard to see. The software will try and take care of that, but you have to be careful of that. And then saturated intensities, which you can see are in red, are often at the peaks of these lunar images. And those can cause two issues. One is you've saturated the camera, so now you don't actually know what the true values are, even the blurred values. And they can also cause ringing artifacts if you don't take care of them carefully. So one of the important things to know about deconvolution is that while it retains the total number of photons in your image, if you have a proper deconvolution algorithm, which is the Richard and Lucy is it maintains the total photons, but the actual intensities can get much higher, and they can often exceed a standard 16-bit range of your image. So in this image here, we can see that the original data goes from 0 to 65, 535. So it's like there's a few saturated pixels in here. And then, but after the deconvolution, our dynamic range actually went all the way up to 214,000. Now, there's only a few pixels out there that are at 214,000. And those are the ones that are around. If we go back here, you can see these are these red pixels at the very tips of the craters. Those are the ones that are now beyond 65,000. So the histogram shows there's only a few of them. So even though the peak increased by a factor of almost 4, typically what you get is the contrast increases 50 to 100%. So your data that had a normal peak of 65,000 now is probably closer to 100 to 120,000. And so we have to be take, this is not a problem if you're using 32-bit file formats, but most software doesn't handle 32-bit. So we have to take care of this when we're saving our data, if you're going to take the output images into a different application. So, for example, in a normal render, this is a clip called a clip rendering. The top 0.1% of pixels went from 65,000 to 96,000. So that's like a 50% increase. And so when you save the data, and there are auto-saving modes, there's a ways of bit saving both the 32-bit floating point and a rendered view, which can be rescaled such that you can then take it into a different application, especially if you're doing mosaics. So lunar mosaics. Lots of people like to do lunar mosaics because you know, the moon is actually pretty big, depending on the size of your telescope. And so you have to stitch all these panels together. Now, you want to do the deconvolution before you do the mosaic. Some people try to decon the mosaic image, which has two issues. One is the decon will always often reveal how bad the stitching is, because it reveals any particular subtle edges. Also, the image you're putting in is going to be very, very large, which and deconvolution does require a fair amount of memory. Not massive, but it's compared to most computers, but you know, definitely larger than you know, the amount of size of an image. And so you want deconvolution before the mosaic, and we want to maintain intensity consistency between panels so that the stitching software has a better can stitch those things consistently. And most software doesn't support 32-bit floating point. I actually found out that Microsoft ICE and GIMP both do support 32-bit floating point. The problem is they require the images to be in the range of 0 to 1. And so there is a way to rescale the data in this the software into the range of 0 to 1, but you still need to make sure that you scale it appropriately so that otherwise you'll still get clipping artifacts. And so often the maximum pixel intensity is a poor reference point. So there are clip modes such as auto range, clip, or manual range that you can set as a render mode, so that when it saves as 16-bit, it's actually now consistent for doing mosaicing. And so there are also, I can get into this more in the documentation, but there are expert settings based on feedback from users that allow automatic scaling and gamma to be applied as part of the processing. And if you're worried about dividing all your data by 2 at the end, you're actually only losing like 1 significant bit, which is almost certainly noise, given all the other issues that you have in collecting the data. The next thing about is that actually the point spread function varies across the image, particularly on lunar images. And there's a whole bunch of reasons for that. One is, while the atmosphere varies dynamically, it does sort of average out, so that the atmospheric variability is less of an issue. But of course, your instrument might have variable focus or coma or astigmatism across the field. So one part of the camera may have slightly different point spread functions, and very subtle differences in point spread function can actually have major issues. Also, the restoration depends on the blur, the detail, and the signal to noise. So different parts of your lunar image may have different levels of noise and detail. And so you actually need to process each of those regions separately. So this is why trying to use one kernel to process your entire moon function often doesn't result in, has poor results. And actually, the other thing is the stacking itself, the accuracy of the stacking is dependent on the contrast of the features. So I often find that the stacking actually is able to register edges very well, or like the Terminator, because there's lots of edges, there's sharp features there, but sort of other regions of the moon that have more direct illumination are much harder and have a slightly less sharp than other parts of the moon where you have different edges. And so a single point spread function is insufficient. So now this means you actually need to go and break up your image into a whole bunch of different points and process them all separately and then blend them all together. if you really want to do that. But then what we can do is tile processing. And so what the software will do is it'll break the image up into little tiles that overlap, and it'll process each one of those independently. It'll estimate a point spread function for each one of those tiles separately, and then put it all back together. And so this example, this image is about 5,000 pixels across. My rule of thumb is you want between 5 to 10 tiles across the surface. This image here had with a 10 to 20% overlap. So this is a 500 pixel tile, 100 pixel overlap. It's a 14 by 13 grid. And then you also have to be careful about processing on the hard edges versus the surface. The software has, the algorithm has a hard time estimating the point spread function when you have a hard edge of the disk or the terminator. So it's it might be hard to see here, but the green tiles are where the blind PSF is estimated. The yellow tiles are ones that still are on the lunar surface, but are close to it in edge. And so in that case, what it'll do is it'll take the point spread function from the nearest green tile, and then the red tiles are ignored because they're just background. And so you will see here, this is on the right here are all the different point spread functions for the different tiles. And you can see there, this is pseudo color, but you can see the ones on the right are subtly, like slightly blurrier or slightly more smeared out compared to ones on the left. And that's all to do with the level of detail and edge detail resolution and its ability to do the processing. And so this is then, so I'm going to pause for questions here. So this is this final image processed by Michael Owen, which was the tile decon, and then he did a mineral moon of it. And then there's a very extensive discussion of this on the Cloudy Nights. I've put the link below here. I will make the that you can then look at and get the understanding of how all this works. So let me just pause there for questions.
David, so are you telling me that this automatic tiling, this is part of the point spread function that the operator doesn't have to lay out these tiles, or do you have to, is this a separate process?
So there's a button you click that says tile processing. It'll automatically put the tiles on there. It'll automatically work out, you know, what's a good tile versus a bad tile. So it's essentially one-click processing. So it's just something to be, and the tile processing does take a lot longer than, because it has to estimate a point spread function like 100 times, you know, 100, 200 times. So it'll take a lot longer, but it's, if you try and take one point spread function and process your entire image, you may see either artifacts or you'll see things that are not quite as good. And then, but yeah, so again, it's all being automated. There are lots of people who will do, you can actually do tiled processing of panels that are then stitched together as a mosaic. But again, it's all one click.
Can you process multiple images all at once?
Yes. Yeah. So there are lots of people who are collecting. Basically, you take all the images that you get from AutoStacker, and then you can just tell it to automatically process everything. Once you understand, here are the settings that generally work for me, which is basically working out the denoising settings, which I'll get into. Once you sort of have a happy process, you can look on Astro as all the images that have been processed with the software, and yeah, it'll do all that automatically. One click, you go to bed. Anything from the YouTubes?
Yeah, I've been monitoring the YouTube, and I don't think anybody's asked us any questions specifically about this, so you're free to go on.
Okay, I can see I'm going long tonight, so I'll try and hurry this up a bit. There's a couple of other things. Nonlinear data. You have to be very careful about nonlinear data, and particularly gamma correction. This is an example of an image that was converted automatically from camera raw to TIFF, and when that happened, there was a automatic gamma correction of 2.2 applied. And the thing is, nonlinear data will cause decon artifacts at edges. So if you could get a result where you have like weird artifacts or weird ringing at edges or weird things on craters, then the software, there's a thing called capture gamma, where you can tell the software how your data was captured. So either if there was a gamma on the camera, or if there was a gamma that was applied in pre-processing the data through some sort of pre-conversion. If you tell the software that a gamma was applied, then the processing comes out much better. And the rule of thumb is, like, if your image actually looks like what the eye perceives, if the original image, that looks like what the eye perceives the moon to be, then you probably have a gamma applied that needs to be taken care of. Linear data sort of looks weird, it looks dark, which is why you have like gamma applied after all your processing. The next thing is undersampled or drizzled images. And when you have to be very careful if you're using critically or undersampled images, because undersampled deconvolution will have artifacts due to aliasing. Now, one way to fix that is to upsample the image, deconvolve it, and then downsample. Or you can also use drizzling, but you have to be very careful because drizzle can have weird spectral artifacts. So this is an example of an undersampled Plato image. This is your original image of Plato. And then if you look at the FFT, you will see here that and those of you who may not be familiar with FFTs, this is just the spectral information, but you'll see that the center is the 0, and then the highest frequencies go out to the corners. And you'll see here the highest frequencies hit the edge of the image, which means that you are having aliasing and you're losing spectral information. And when that happens, your decon will give you, it might be hard to see here, you'll get weird artifacts, you'll get over-sharpened edges, and you'll get aliasing artifacts. And the point spread function will actually sort of come out really weird and small. So that's so what you can do is there is an option in AutoStacker to drizzle. And so if you use drizzle carefully, you can actually get a much better result. So in this case, this is a drizzle of 1.5. Now you can see here that the processed image has the Fourier transform, has very distinct, the bright region is where the information is, and the outer regions, which are dark, is where the noise is. And so there's sort of now room for the resolution to grow. And so now the deconvolution result and of the drizzled image is much better. You don't get the weird artifacts on the edges of the craters like you used to. Now you say, oh, well, if 1.5 is good, let's go to 3 drizzled. Well, what happens when you run a drizzle 3? So if you just run without telling the software what's happening, if you try and run a drizzle, you will suddenly get all these very weird gridding artifacts. And the thing is, if you look at the Fourier transform of a 3x3 3x drizzle, you see the center region here of the point spread functions, the valid region, but suddenly you have all these very weird high frequency artifacts that are actually part that often come out when you are having drizzling. And if you process this image without taking account of that, then it'll amplify all these artifacts and think they're real data, and you'll get this horrible gridding result. So people often will send me data, I'll process it, and you get this horrible gridding artifact, and then you look at the Fourier transform, and then you go like, did you drizzle this data? And they go, yes, I drizzled. And then, so you have to be careful with that. So the software will detect the term drizzle in the file name, because AutoStacker will put in the drizzle 15 or drizzle 30, or I think upsample or resample. And so the software will identify that. What the software will then do automatically is it'll then ignore all those high frequency frequencies when doing the processing, and now you get a much better high resolution drizzled result, which doesn't have those artifacts. Now, by looking at this, and I can tell you from experience from that people have told me, is that you may want to drizzle 3x, deconvolve, and then rescale it back down to the equivalent of 2x. There's a little bit of there's a little bit too much magnification here. You've got empty magnification, which may not be helpful, but by binning it back down or rescaling it back down to 2x, then your your features will often look a lot more natural. And then this is really just quickly into just some post-decon contrast enhancement. So this is after the decon. We can use, global HDR for high dynamic range imaging. There's a function called Reinhard, which is, it's very good for deep space objects, but can also be used on Lunar. And the way that the software works is if you do a Reinhard and then you do a Clay, which is contrast limited adaptive histogram equalization, then you can get much higher contrast across the entire field. Now, I would be careful about how you use Clay. It's very easy to get like over sharpened or artificial images, but that option is available as a post-decon visualization enhancement. And so that there's just a quick mention, there's when you tell the software Lunar versus Planetary, you're really just telling it some presets. It doesn't actually need to know too much, but lunar solar images are typically higher signal to noise ratio. There's a full disk or partial disk, and there's often tiling required. Planetary images are much noisier, so the algorithm will use a bit more softer approach to processing planetary images. And the way that it puts the region of interest is it assumes there's a small disk, and it tries to extract the point spread function from the disk, which is different from how it does it for lunar images. And you also have to be careful about how you treat processing large planets at long focal length versus small planets, or images from short focal lengths. My rule of thumb is for Jupiter is you extract the point spread function from the surface features, avoiding the planet edge. But for Saturn, you want to put the region of interest around the whole planet, and I'll show you some of that soon. So,
David,
for example, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, you're getting the stripe across your face again.
Oh, okay, am I? Okay, I didn't close my blinds quite enough. I'll try and. Well, hopefully you're not looking at me. You could be looking at just at this screen.
No, I guess it's not as obvious on YouTube. I just thought you'd like to know.
Damn summer solstice. So this is an example of processing Jupiter. This image is courtesy of David Richards. So you can load the image in, and then the first thing we can do is a white balance. So that there's an automatic white balance functionality. Then what I do is there are often things that are hidden in the background that you don't see, because this image by itself, looks fine, nice black background. But if you put it in logarithmic mode, you can then see that there's like this weird unprocessed region in the data, and this all comes from the stacking and the planet moving around as you're doing the imaging. So we want to set the region of interest just on a region that includes only what I would call valid data. So we can set the region of interest. So now we're ignoring that weird background that can cause problems in the processing. And then, and so once you've cropped the region of interest, then we can, then you just click Run Decon, and then, okay, sorry. So you click the region of interest, auto ROI, which will set the region of interest on the surface of the planet. It'll avoid the edges. It does about 70% of the disk width. And if you have multiple frames and when you click auto ROI, that'll turn yellow. That means it'll then auto ROI every frame independently, and it'll actually, if your planet shifts around, it'll automatically track the planet and put the ROI on there automatically. And then once you have the region of interest, you just click Run Decon, and then there's your result. So again, one click for planetary processing. There's a few differences. The main thing that you'll be changing is the denoise settings. And this is very much dependent on your data and your preferences for how you like the results. So the default is, so there's a denoise percentage, which is for the point spread function estimation, and there's a denoise after, which is for the image restoration. And typically, these are called denoise before and after. And then the default is what we call denoise 100-100. which is 100% denoise on both the before and after processing. Now, in this particular data set, you might think like that is too much denoising might smear out your images. And so what you can try is different settings based on your data. And so there's, for example, a 50-50, there's 0-0, which may look a little bit too noisy. And then often what is a very good, which might seem weird, but there's is a 0-1, which is 0 denoise, and then 1 for the post-processing activates a very slight noise filtering, which gets rid of a lot of the noise. So most users spend most of the time just sort of like adjusting the denoise settings. And once you have a happy set of denoise settings, you can then pretty much use those for all your processing. Again, proper setting of gamma, what I often find is that when processing Jupiter, a gamma is often applied in the camera when you're setting it up in either fire capture or sharp cap. If you have a gamma applied, you need to tell the software that a gamma was applied. Sometimes in the metadata it's there and sometimes it's not. What I find is if I don't have a gamma set, then you'll get an ringing on the edge, you'll get a rind on the planet. And so you can see here when I set the gamma to 2, suddenly that edge artifact disappears. I'm not 100% sure if that's actually a true effect of the gamma on the data, but it's definitely a good way of getting rid of weird edge artifacts. Is essentially putting a gamma of 2 de-weights the edges of the image that have lower intensity. So there's a by default there's a thing called PSF from luminance. So especially when you're using one-shot color cameras, is it'll extract the point spread function from the luminance from a weighted RGB, and then you can use that point spread function for the entire image. And process luminance only is the default. And when you do that, you'll get the quick result, but the colors will look very much similar to the original data. If you turn off process luminance only, then it'll process the L, the R, the G, and the B channels with the same point spread function, and you'll often get much better color discrimination. They're sort of like the muted tones of the colors will come out once you process it as LRGB. And that again is also done automatically.
David, before
yes.
we go too far away from the lunar, but I think the question would probably apply to the planetary as well. Damien K wants to know what your sampling is in all these images, moon images he's speaking. Lucky image ratio, 5 times pixel size, he asks. Then he comes back and he says F ratio equals 5 times pixel size. But what's your pixel scale in these images?
So in again, I do not do much planetary image or lunar imaging, but if you look on cloudy nights and you listen to people like Michael Owen, he will very much say that you want something close to 5 times the typical sampling of your image. So if you have a lot of these images are sampled at below 1/4 of an arc second, probably closer to 0.15 to 0.1 arc second pixel size equivalents. I know there are various rules for the sampling, and often those sampling are much higher than you may originally anticipate is actually a good thing to do. The trade-off, of course, is between higher sampling and noise. And so you're trying to balance short exposures with high magnification with getting enough signal coming through. And so it somewhat depends on your equipment, but I know exposures between, you want like 5 to 10 millisecond exposures. If you can have, people typically use Barlow's of 2 to 5x. And if you're wanting the high resolution lunar imaging, then 0.1 to 0.2 arc second per pixel is my rough guides. But there are some very good FAQs on cloudy nights in the lunar and the planetary forums that'll answer all those sorts of questions.
Okay, thank you. Damien says, okay, he gets it.
Okay,
Thanks.
And one interesting thing that often happens is people will say that the deconvolution looks too sharp. Now, that might be because people are never used to seeing a sharp astronomy image. But I will, everything in here is sort of like artistic interpretation. So if you feel that the image is too sharp, there is a blending operation which allows you to blend the original image with the deconvolved image. This in here, for example, gives you a 50% blend. There's a real-time preview, so 50% might be a bit soft, but you could do like 70, 80%. And there's also the ability to auto-save that. So you can do the decon and have it auto-save both the full decon and the blended result automatically, so you can then go back and look at it. So the interesting thing is if you look at the images from the NASA Juno, I guess the question is, are those over-enhanced, or are those the actual true, what the planet looks like? And maybe the first person to go to Jupiter can tell us who's correct. Here's some processing by Michael Owen, which you can look at on AstroBin. And this is just showing that this is like automated processing of data. So each one of here is a 21-minute derotation of 7 3-minute stacks, all individually and automatically deconvolved. And so, you just load the stacks in, and then it'll process all those 9 images automatically. Here's an animation showing the original and the deconvolved image. And the most interesting part of this is that I've blown up the point spread function and put a pseudo color map on it. So you can actually see that the point spread function varies between frames as the seeing changes. And while poorer seeing is can't be completely compensated for, it can be partially compensated for. So this can help to sort of even out some of the irregularities in your imaging, and also why one point spread function applied to all your different frames is not necessarily applicable if your image is getting blurrier or sharper as your imaging session goes on.
What does the the color in your zoomed PSF show? Is that the color of the image, or does it represent the degree of
so it's
convolution, I guess?
Yeah, so it's a pseudo color map from blue to red, and all it's trying to do is it's trying to show you the very, very faint details in the background that are often hard to see in just a grayscale color map. So it's just, it's really trying to show you both the very dim regions and the faint regions using a color. But yeah, it's basically just intensity.
Sure.
And as you can see, like as it gets, the blurrier the image, the wider it gets. So you can see that, as it pulsates in and out, it's because of the changing in the seeing throughout the night.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, sometimes things can go wrong. And one of the things that I found that causes lots of problems is actually the shadow of moons, particularly over Jupiter. And the thing is, extreme edges can cause issues with point spread function estimation. And then if you don't handle it properly, then you can get the center image, which is sort of like, essentially the point spread function is inaccurately biased by the very sharp edges from the shadow of the moon. And you get like ringing, you get edge artifacts, you get noise amplification, so it just doesn't work properly. Now the software will try and automatically handle these weird moon shadow artifacts automatically. And when it does that, then you get the image on the right, which is a much better restoration. And again, it has to try and do this automatically because the shadow will move over the planet if you're doing animations. The other way to avoid this is, of course, is to put the region of interest, avoiding the shadow itself. And then, so just some really quick examples, because I'm running a little long. This is just some examples. These are Astrosurface actually has some very nice example data that you can download and test out yourself. So This is just examples of some sunspots. So for example, I can clock about the sunspot and then just process that. That's again 1 click. Here's an example of a surface with a prominence. And in this case, I like to put the region of interest manually over the surface because it is it's brighter and has more detail than the prominence. And then, so this is the deconvolution within auto range. We can then do higher dynamic range to see the prominences, and then we can do contrast enhancement to really bring out both the surface of the sun and the prominence itself. Again, this is all 1 click blind decon.
David, is this done within BiggSky?
Yep, this is all. Yeah, you can download the data and test it out for yourself. You can see here, all I did in this image is I put the region of interest over in the orange box over the surface, and then I clicked run decon, and then I adjusted the renderings at the end. The one nice thing about the surface of the sun is it doesn't actually have a hard edge like the moon does. It's because it has that little, fuzzy fringe, which means it's a little easier to process. So anyway, so that's a solar example. And then here's processing Saturn. Again, this is Astro surface data. And in this case, you can see here in the orange, I put the region of interest around the entire planet. This is because there's not really many surface features on the planet itself to try and extract out the point spread function. But in these cases, it worked pretty well. You don't want to, and you want to exclude as much background as possible, because that's just background noise that sort of biases the processing, because the PSF estimation is really sensitive. Here's an example where things do not work well. And the problem with this data is it actually has a hard 0 background, and which causes, which means there's been like a lot of like pre-processing, or there's been processing on this data before, more than just stacking. And so the cyan region shows you the actual black regions of this data set. So after I do color calibration, if you try and process it, you get this sort of weird ringy result. If I put the region of interest actually over the planet itself, which is not ideal, but we're trying to avoid this blue region, then the result's okay. It's not, I wouldn't call it a great result. And this one also requires pretty high denoising compared to some data. So, it doesn't work for every single type of data, but it's sort of understanding why things may or may not work for your data to see how things go. And then this is an example of Mars. Mars is sort of interesting because, again, it does have surface features so you can extract the point spread function from the surface itself. This is, again, a movie from Michael Owen where it's been deconvolved automatically using the software. And you can see all this on Astrophotography as well. I put the link below. There's a question also, when you use WinJupos, should you do the deconvolution before or after? Basically, you should do the decon before, because you want to deconvolve the least manipulated data, and then by combining the frames, you can then improve the signal to noise ratio if there's any like residual noise. So you want to decon right after stacking, then run it through WinJupos. The PSF may also vary between frames. And then you could, if you really want to, try a second decon on the final stacked WinJupos result if you want to see if you can get any extra result out of there. But I've seen edge artifacts. If you try and run WinJupos first and then do the decon, you might see edge artifacts because of the processing from WinJupos. There's another thing of, you may actually want to stack a lot more frames than you previously have done. This is an example of stacking 5, 10, all the way up to 90% of your video frames. And the result here just keeps getting better, even if you have more frames, because less noise overcomes adding slightly blurrier frames. Now, you want to get rid of the really bad frames, the ones at the real tail end. So those bottom 10, 20% you may want to get rid of. But again, this is something you might want to try. In Auto Stacker, you can of course set different levels of stacking. You can set 10, 20, 50, and 75 or 80%, and then run the decon automatically. and see what works with your data. But this is something often people would use only a small percentage, but you might be able to get much more. I've almost finished. So you often get a question of, can you run the decon on the deconvolved result, which is not something I recommend. However, there is an option called more decon, which allows you to run a second decon to find if there's any residual point spread function that the first process missed out. And so what it generates is 2 point spread functions. Again, this is all internal, but it's always referring back to the original raw data, not to the previous deconvolved result. Typically, the results will look slightly over-sharpened, is what I found. But for those of you crazy people who really want to push this to the max, there is a more decon button that does essentially decon the decon. So some recommendations is one, collect linear data. Make sure to expand, when you collect your data, make sure the ROI is actually expanded around the object. You don't want it super tight, because if you're too tight to the object and the blur extends beyond the image that you captured, then the processing will be suboptimal. So capture a slightly larger region if you can. Capture in 16-bit rather than 8-bit. Don't clip the background or saturate intensities if possible. Stack more frames, and then when you're doing the processing, you want to adjust the noise settings to your personal preference. If you can get an image that is processed nicely with the settings of 0, 1, then that is sort of like you've done the best you possibly can, because it's deconvolving without any noise reduction, which means your sort of capture settings are now optimal. If you're doing a lunar solar images, you process the luminance only. You leave the color by itself. You can then do mineral moon vibrance adjustments later. If you're doing planetary, get the point spread function from the luminance and then process all 3 channels by turning process luminance off. And then some other software you can use, now these are all free, is Microsoft Ice for mosaics. You can use WaveSharp. A lot of people use that for FFT denoising afterwards. And then you can use GIMP from adjusting the curves. You can do deep sky processing with the software. I have not done as much work on this. It's almost all working, but it works. It has a thing called a Smart Project, which will automatically identify all the files and subdirectories, automatically sort them, and then it has special a thing called a Smart Update for multi-night imaging. Now, the only most interesting thing is, like, in GPU, it does have a GPU processing for all these things, and with an RTX 4800, I can stack 20 60-megapixel images in a minute on that GPU, which seems to be pretty fast. So what's this current status? Well, there is a beta that is now available from my website for testing. There is a 30-day free trial that will be extended during the beta testing, and which will be at least extended. Anyone who's already downloaded, I will extend the testing through at least through the end of July. There's a getting started guide available, and I'm working on getting as much documentation done. So the website and the documentation is still under development, so forgive the mess. I will note that all the software is built on the MATLAB platform, which you may be familiar with, but you do not need a MATLAB license to run it. The MATLAB compiler runtime is provided automatically and only needs to be installed once. And it provides a rapid development platform, cross-platform compatibility, and robust error handling, but you cannot run your own MATLAB scripts in the software or anything like that. So just, you will see MATLAB mentioned many times when you're doing the installation, but you don't have to worry about that. They're just sort of the underlying technology. If you have any questions, you can email me at the bigskyimaging@gmail.com. And thank you for your attention. Here are some links that you can check out to see the software. And then the only thing, I guess, if you're mentioning using the deconvolution, instead of calling it BS processing, please call it BSD processing for BiggSky deconvolution, and BSS if you're using the stacking functionality. And in honor of the 50th anniversary of JAWS, I'm just going to tell you, you're going to need more data. Thank you very much.
You can stop sharing now, David.
I should mention thank you to all. There's all these beta testers and people who've helped me in this whole processing, getting the software going. So I very much appreciate their help.
Well, as tools move along, we are committed to what we use now, and software like you're presenting gives us something to think about. There's no question about it. So I always revert to these are tools, not rules. So if something better comes along, and that's our new standard. Have you ever thought about the difference between Decon and what you do and the AI programs that kind of, I'm not quite sure how they work, but they look at examples and try to anticipate what the original image looks like?
Yeah, I have not used, I guess there are two different things. There's like the Topaz type systems, which are like very much more designed for,
Photography, right?
Photography and, and earthbound images. So, landscapes, humans, I've seen some weird things, that are trained on, for example, that might be trained on, animal fur, and then you run your solar image through it, and suddenly it turns in all your solar filaments into leopard fur, because that's what it thinks it does. And, all these tools are fine. What you need to do is the simple rule I always use, you look at your process result, you look at the features, and you look at what it reconstructs, and it's like, can you see that in your original data? And can you convince yourself that that data can be justified to generating that result? And sometimes it can, and sometimes it's like, I do not know. I cannot, see how it got this out, or how did it turn, these two little fibers into this thing. So they all have to be done with caution if you're using, something for astronomy that's been trained on, terrestrial data. I know that things like Blur Exterminator have an AI model, but they are not doing but that's designed for, extracting, doing the processing, and they're trained properly to, get the right data. And, they are not doing these things, whatever Samsung did with their phone, where you took a picture of the moon and then it sort of went to a database and then downloaded a better picture. Some people will not like AI because they think that's what it's doing. It is not doing that. The proper AI programs are not doing that. And so the only reason I'm not using AI is I'm not sure I'm smart enough to work out how to use AI. And I'm sort of, I'm in with my classical hammer and my abacus, and everybody else is out there with their TI smart calculators. So I haven't quite got there yet. But I can see there's definitely parts of where AI could be super useful in terms of like working out what the point spread function is, or identifying problems in the image and stuff like that. So
interesting idea.
Jeff Weiss has a question. How much more data am I going to need to get this to work right?
Well, the more data is pretty, basically, if you run your image through and it comes out, the processing comes out noisy, then you need more data to reduce the noise. And so there's one of two things happen: either that you increase the noise settings and you want to balance the noise amplification versus the smoothing. And because the typical thing is people don't collect enough data because the blurry image looks fine. But when you start to enhance that image and you start to boost the frequencies and you suddenly see lots of, your features aren't coming out like you want, then that's where you run into problems. So, I think on lunar images, people, stack 500 to 1,000 frames. But again, it depends on your camera. It depends on your seeing. It depends on how, how much signal you're getting through. So it's always your mileage may vary.
Okay. And the way you say that, no matter what, it's always such and so. Does BiggSky itself require any more data than you would have gotten, that you would have needed anyway to do?
No, I mean, if you take any image that you process out of AutoStacker and you put it into WaveSharp or Astrosurface or any other processing program, it'll just take that. You just take that. It'll process that thing. Now, what happens to the image at the other end will tell you what you need to do next. If it comes out, oh, this is not great, it's like, it's not very sharp, it's like, you know, it's very noisy or things like that, it'll inform you what you need to do. You're like, oh, okay, I need to adjust my acquisition or processing, setup. You know, it can't just take, you know, you can't take one frame of the moon, capture with your camera, you know, and it's horrible and noisy and get a magical result. It's not, you know, it's all a matter of balance.
You know, you had a kind of a throwaway slide there where about you should really stack more, a higher percentage. That, I want to say that's a no-no, but I've always worked the opposite way and proved it by looking at the quality of the image of, say, 10, 20, 50, 100, or 200 images. So the more images you use, the blurrier the image becomes. So I shy away from that. But what you're saying is there's information there that you can extract out with Decon better than if you say use 10, you could use 100. You'll get a better.
It's all a balance. You know, you look at that curve, and you know, if it's a, you know, the slope goes down gently, right? So you know, the 20 frames is not particularly much worse than, you know, the 10s and 30, but you know, when it sort of falls off the end, you know, you get rid of all those really bad ones. Then, and this is probably might be slightly different from deep sky imaging, where some people like really just use only the best frames. But you know, again, you can take your image, you can have the software automatically stack a whole bunch of very you know, different percentages and see what you get.
Yeah, actually, with Auto Stacker, you can go back to the original data and just say, okay, I'm going to stack 50%.
Exactly.
And see what, I would never do that, by the way.
But you can try and see what happens.
Up to this point, I would never do that, but this has caused me to think. By the way, I think we've told you before that we continue on after the program ends, and you would be welcome. And actually, I would appreciate if you stay a little bit
Will do.
when we're done.
So
If
thank
you
you
have
so
the
much for
time.
running.
How are we doing? Anything more? We got YouTube covered, Alex?
No, I think we're clear on YouTube. Let me scroll. Yeah, we're good.
We're good. Well, boy, that was a very interesting presentation, especially for those of us that are doing, well, I'm doing solar imaging. I'd be certainly interested to give this a try to see whether this becomes one of my favorite tools in the future. But for all of you out there, we have a program next week, despite what we said earlier. Rod Palmier will come on. And even though the subject seems a little mundane, Rod's presentations are never mundane. They're always interesting. Last time he did one on clusters, and we said, oh my God, God cluster. How boring could that be? And it turned out to be anything but boring. As I remember, we all learned quite a bit, and I'm sure Rod will have a lot to say next week. So we appreciate you all coming back, and I think we've kind of come to the end of the program for all set. So Molly, are you running it, or?
Yeah.
Okay, so everyone, hopefully we'll all see you next week.
Good night, everyone. Thank you.
Have a
Good
good
night,
week.
everyone.
Good night.